We're incredibly lucky to have Wolfgang Streeck with us this evening. In terms of the work of the last decade, Wolfgang is, I think, the most significant radical theorist, radical analyst of advanced capitalism and, one might say, its discontents. By contrast to both Piketty and Andrew Glynn, both of whom have written tremendous books on capitalism, Capital Itself and Capitalism Unleashed by Andrew Glynn, Streeck has developed an analysis of capitalism which is grounded in history, in disequilibrium and change, and it's very powerful. Over the whole period going back to the 1980s, he's been the dominant figure in German industrial sociology and in German political economy. He's the director of the Max-Planck Institute in Cologne, which is the big job to have. And he was a major figure he played a major role in the development of neo-corporatism. And in 1985, first time I met him, he came and gave a lecture in Oxford. In fact, Colin Crouch had invited him to do this. I was at that stage a perfectly innocent and decent economist. I taught macroeconomics. And Wolfgang's lecture was called Beneficial Constraints. And in this lecture, he explained how if the government puts constraints on companies, it makes it difficult for companies to fire people. What companies will do will then be to invest in the skills of these employees in order to try and expand their exports. And this idea that you could have constraints which would be beneficial was, of course, a very radical idea for an economist to be confronted with. But that was really the moment I was completely persuaded by. He's a very persuasive person, by the way. That was the moment, I think, when I really thought, oh God, I've got to give up economics and become a political economist. This is much too much fun. And so, Wolfgang, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. The book will not be recapitulated in this lecture. It's out there. You can buy it. It's worth the money. It's good. It's a good book. What I will do is I will elaborate on a specific aspect in the book and add a few insights that came to me during the 2 years after the book was finished. And you will see from the lecture how it links to the various subjects of the analysis. The title, let me see if I can get this here. Yeah, the title is "The Rise of the European Consolidation State." This process follows the displacement of the classical tax state, or Steuerstaat in Schumpeter's word, by which the displacement by what I have called the debt state. So Steuerstaat, tax state, debt state, consolidation state. A process that began in the 1980s in all rich capitalist democracies. The rise of the debt state. Consolidation is the contemporary response to the fiscal crisis of the state, envisaged as early as the late 1960s by the Marxist theoretician James O'Connor, incidentally, when post-war growth had come to an end. Both the long-term increase in public debt and the current global attempts to bring it under control were intertwined with the financialization of advanced capitalism and its complex uses and discontents. As I will show, the ongoing shift towards a consolidation state involves a deep rebuilding of the political institutions of post-war democratic capitalism and its political and its international order, in particular in Europe, where consolidation coincides with an unprecedented increase in the scale of political rule under European Monetary Union and the transformation of the latter into an asymmetric fiscal stabilization regime. In the following, I begin by briefly recounting the development that led to current consolidation efforts, with the financial crisis of 2008 as something like a critical juncture. Then I will sketch out the domestic and international politics of fiscal consolidation at a time of low growth or even secular stagnation, as Larry Summers now calls it, a long-term increase in economic inequality and record overall indebtedness. So the three things: low growth, inequality, and indebtedness. In the question and answer session, we can look at the particularities of the European development. What I will do now is outline the general process. So the first part is called From the Fiscal Crisis of the State to the Great Recession. And I may interject that the idea of the book as well as of this lecture is to put these critical dramatic events into a historical sequence so that we are not made to believe that a thing like 2008 is simply something that happens out of the blue. It hangs in a longer, logical, explainable sequence that is the most much more interesting than the event is the history of the event. So by the mid-1970s, the accumulated debt of states in the OECD in the OECD world began to increase steeply and steadily. So this is an average, but it doesn't matter if you take the individual countries; they're all basically the same. Indebtedness rose by and large simultaneously, regardless of country, national economic performance, or the political complexion of the government of the day. North Sea oil made a difference for Britain, unification for Germany, the rise and fall of defense spending for the United States, but always only temporarily. Indebtedness increased for 2 decades until the mid-1990s, when debt levels seemed to stabilize. After 2008, however, they rapidly returned to the long-term trend line. A growing level of public debt is the result of cumulative non-Keynesian deficits in public budgets. Non-Keynesian because the Keynesian deficits are to be wiped out in the subsequent upswing. An enduring inadequacy of government revenue compared to government spending. A popular explanation for this is offered by the public choice school of institutional economics, which conceives public finance as a poorly managed common pool from which democratic electoral majorities and office-seeking politicians may satisfy ever more extravagant collective demands without having to assume responsibility for the costs. As I have shown, however, in the book, the secular rise of public debt in the OECD countries coincided with a general, equally secular decline in the political power of organized labor and social democratic politics, as indicated by long-term sinking rates of unionization, falling participation in national elections, an almost complete disappearance of strikes, high and steady rates of unemployment, stagnant wages, and rising economic inequality. If redistributive democracy didn't do it, what did? As mentioned, Already in the late 1960s, James O'Connor, writing in the tradition of authors such as Schumpeter and Goldscheid, someone who was almost forgotten, turn of the century German sociologist and economist, predicted a widening gap between the fiscal means governments could mobilize under capitalist relations of production and ownership, and the demands made by an advancing capitalist economy on state support. States under capitalism, according to O'Connor, had to provide for both the legitimacy and the efficiency of capital accumulation, the former through all sorts of social consumption, the latter through investment in a public infrastructure. O'Connor also expected mounting pressure on state finances by public sector trade unions, claiming, that was 1970, claiming the same wages and benefits as workers in private industry, and thereby exposing the state to the cost disease of the service sector. It is interesting that Daniel Bell, almost at the opposite end of the political spectrum, at least at that time, found much to endorse in O'Connor's analysis, although he seems to have placed the emphasis somewhat like the public choice school, less on functional needs and structural contradictions, as I suggest, than on cultural change away from Protestant values towards materialistic consumerism or bourgeois hedonism, as he calls it. With hindsight, the route from the tax to the debt state looks less straightforward than what one might have expected at its beginning. Empirically, deficits became endemic, and debt started to accumulate after the end of inflation in the early 1980s. Before that, high inflation had substituted for real growth in wiping out parts of the public debt, thus slowing down its accumulation, which explains why Germany, having a very low inflation rate in the 70s, started with the increase in public debt earlier than the others. It had also for a while kept up employment, it being inflation. With monetary stabilization, unemployment became high and chronic, causing social spending to increase until, with a delay of a decade or so, it was again brought under control by neoliberal reforms. So far, public debt was basically a matter of the inertia of social security systems functioning as automatic stabilizers, not of growing demands of spoiled citizens for public handouts. In addition, however, the end of inflation ended what is called bracket creep in the United States, the movement of taxpayers into higher income tax rates with rising nominal incomes. Moreover, it reinforced tax resistance, in particular among the middle class, and lent momentum to calls for tax reform, meaning tax cuts that typically benefited the payers of high taxes most. Reagan tax cuts, early 1980s. Overall, the fiscal crisis of the state turned out to be caused less by an increase in citizen entitlements than by a general decline in the taxability of democratic capitalist societies. You see how roughly in the 1980s, the rise of the tax revenue stops, then sort of moves around 37%, and then begins to decline. So while tax revenue had until the mid-1970s by and large kept pace with public spending, by the mid-1980s it began to stagnate. Until, after a short recovery, it started declining by the end of the century. By 2007, taxation levels were back where they had been 12 years earlier, only to decline further in the course of the financial crisis. A contributing factor was the globalization, quote unquote, of the capitalist economy, which led to increased tax competition among countries, resulting in tax cuts for corporations and earners of high incomes. It also extended the opportunities for owners of capital to evade taxation by moving assets between countries or into international tax havens. The OECD has last year documented this in really dramatic terms. If, in other words, the increasing fiscal problems of the rich capitalist democracies after the 1970s were due to a revolution of rising demands, that revolution had occurred not among ordinary citizens, but among capital and those in command of it. Another respect in which early theories of fiscal crisis had failed to anticipate what was coming was that they underestimated the possibilities of capitalist states to finance deficits for a protracted period of time by borrowing. Actually, the rise of public debt in the final third of the 20th century and beyond was linked to the financialization of the capitalist economy, which in part consisted of an explosive growth of its financial sector and of the amount of credit money it produces. Credit enabled states under capitalism to live with a widening gap between citizen demands and capitalist needs for infrastructural support on the one hand, and the increasingly powerful resistance of taxpayers, individual as well as corporate, against having to pay the bill on the other. Financialization made it possible for governments to push back the moment when they had to do something about the increasing inadequacy of their fiscal means. Low nominal interest rates, made possible by the return to sound money, 1980, led by the American Fed, helped as they made rising debt levels more manageable. In fact, they soon began luring governments into substituting credit for taxes as the latter became more difficult to collect. There also was an international dimension to the debt state, in that in particular the United States began to sell its public debt abroad to sovereign investors, especially the governments of oil-producing countries, looking for opportunities to, quote-unquote, recycle their surpluses and in return gain military protection against regional adversary and their own peoples. They didn't have to buy their own aircraft carriers. Americans did it for them, provided that they lent them the money. In subsequent years, financial services became the by far most important growth industry in the United States and the United Kingdom. After the end of the Bretton Woods monetary regime, with the dollar continuing to be the leading global reserve currency, the United States enjoyed what Giscard d'Estaing called the exorbitant privilege of being able to indent itself internationally in its own currency and repay its debt, if need be, by printing basically unlimited amounts of it. The rich supply of fiat money, of fiat dollars, that ensued nourished an expanding financial industry about to turn into the financial sector of capitalism worldwide. Aggressive deregulation of financial institutions allowed for unprecedented financial innovations, quote unquote, attracting capital from all over the world, and became a major instrument for governments, not only looking for new economic growth, but also, and desperately, for access to credit. For access to credit. There it is. Indeed, as the overall credit supply expanded, it was not just states that became increasingly leveraged, but also corporations and later private households. Thus, the rise of the debt state became embedded in a movement of advanced capitalism as a whole towards higher and higher indebtedness across the board, with public debt, in fact, amounting to no more than a small share of overall debt. Here's 6 countries, beginning in 1995. If you go further back, it is even more, because it is basically a steady increase. Sweden is interesting, where between 1995, the overall indebtedness of the Swedish economy rose from below 400% of GDP to 600% of GDP. And you can see this, if you add the indebtedness also of the financial sector to this, becomes even more dramatic. The United States in 1970, the 4 sectors together amounted to 400% of GDP, and today it is 900%. So going up all the way. How closely the management of the debt state came to be connected to the leveraging of capitalism generally became particularly visible in the 1970s when first attempts were made at fiscal consolidation. In the United States, Clinton had won the presidency in 1992 by promising to do something about the double deficit in the federal budget and the balance of trade. The peace dividend after 1989 seemed to open a window of opportunity for spending cuts. And the two successive fiscal crises in a country like Sweden, 1977 and 1991, were seen as a general warning sign. Orchestrated by the United States through international organizations like the OECD and the IMF, capitalist democracies made an effort to break the upward trend in their indebtedness by returning to balanced budgets through spending cuts and reforms of their budgeting institutions. Indeed, countries succeeded in the 1990s, as you've seen at in the graph, succeeded in the 1990s in bringing down public expenditure to more closely match their stagnant revenue. That was in figure 2. No, here we go. In the United States, this went as far as producing a budget surplus by the end of Clinton's second term. It should be noted, however, that this was to a large extent due to low interest rates made possible by monetary expansion, to savings on defense in the wake of 1989, which were soon to prove short-lived in the United States, to economic growth, especially in the financial sector, blowing up the denominator of the debt equation, and to savings on Social Security as a result of both low unemployment and cuts in entitlement, the end of welfare as we know it, Clinton. The consolidation attempts of the 1990s responded to perhaps misinformed concerns among American voters about high public debt. But one can also assume concerns among creditors about the long-term solvency of sovereign borrowers. In any case, in an era of financial deregulation and expansion, pressures for fiscal consolidation presented an opportunity for cutting back the state in favor of the private sector by referring citizens to private credit as a substitute for previously free public services. Financialization thus not only required fiscal retrenchment to ensure the further creditworthiness of sovereign borrowers, but also made it possible. And with it, the retrenchment of the state. As households indebted themselves in compensating cuts in public provision, supported by low interest rates furnished by cooperative central banks, they opened the door for the private sector moving into fields previously the domain of government. They also filled a gap in aggregate demand caused by cuts in public spending, an effect referred to as privatized Keynesianism. Colin and others have analyzed this in detail. Far from being unsuccessful, the first wave of consolidation managed to bring down public debt during the decade from the mid-1990s to the eve of the Great Recession. Helped in Europe by the Maastricht Treaty, that's how Europe comes in, on European Monetary Union with its debt limits, while hindered in the United States after 2001 by the Bush tax cuts and rapidly rising defense spending. However, all of this was undone when the pyramid of private debt that had grown alongside public debt, and the more so after the increase of the latter had temporarily been halted, collapsed in the fiscal and the financial crisis of 2008. Here again, the close interconnection between the debt state and the financialization of modern capitalism became apparent, as states found themselves forced to absorb the bad debt created by the private sector under financial deregulation. In fact, they had to take up additional debt for stimulus spending to prevent a complete breakdown of their national economies. Ironically, it was the debt that states incurred to protect their societies from the fallout of speculative lending and borrowing, encouraged by government policies of deregulation and cheap money, that made financial markets suspicious about states' capacity to live up to their obligation as debtors. When declining creditor confidence showed itself in rising risk premiums on government bonds from a number of countries, the rising risk premiums, it was time for the debt state to be rebuilt into a consolidation state. Now, second section, consolidation in hard times. I notice we're in time, David. 20 more minutes.
It's all right.
Okay.
It's not hard times yet.
Okay. I need something to drink here. Understanding the politics of the consolidation state requires a look at the political economy of the debt state. The rise of the debt state took place simultaneously with a general increase in economic inequality and was closely linked to it. The declining taxability of capitalist economies in the course of globalization produced a rising demand for credit on the part of governments, while tax cuts for the increasingly rich well-to-do increased the corresponding supply. As a result, the debt state found it convenient to substitute credit for ever more difficult to collect taxes, to the extent that citizens remained willing to consider government bonds a safe investment. States going into debt allow citizens with high incomes to keep their money instead of having it confiscated. Invest it safely, collect interest on it, and pass it on to their children. Unlike what is sometimes suggested in the literature, therefore, the rich in rich countries are not necessarily opposed to government debt, as the alternative may be higher taxes, especially for them. What they must be concerned about, however, is too much debt compromising the capacity of governments to service it. How much debt is too much debt cannot be said generally. States default if they cannot repay old debt by taking up new debt. That's what they normally do every month. At what level of indebtedness financial markets will cease to extend credit to a state to states differs, as it depends not on the magnitude of the existing debt as such, but on the confidence of the markets in being repaid. As debt levels rise, therefore, debt states must intensify their efforts to secure that confidence, to avoid rising risk premiums and at some point losing their ability to borrow. That's the game that is taking place. It's a confidence game. Normally, states can be expected to do their utmost not to default, as this may for a long time exclude them from borrowing. One advantage they have in this respect is that they may use force on their citizens to raise the funds they need to pay their creditors. Governments may also oblige some of their subjects, especially financial firms under prudential supervision, to invest part of their capital in government bonds on the premise that these are particularly safe. On the other hand, since a sovereign government, by definition, controls its own affairs, it cannot be obliged to pay back its debt. And indeed, there's no legal way for creditors to take possession of a defaulting sovereign debtor of the assets of the debtor. In the past, this was sometimes done by war, and it was considered normal. If a state sort of didn't pay back, you sent gunboats. You can't do this. Can't do this anymore in Italy, for example. Failure or refusal of the government maybe so. States can repudiate or only partially pay back their debts, or they can cease to pay at all. Attempts to establish an international bankruptcy regime for states that would regulate the rights and obligations of debtors and creditors and establish some form of international jurisdiction were so far unsuccessful. Fiscal consolidation, then, is essentially a confidence-building measure. Its objective is to make a state attractive for financial investment by making it fit for debt service, for financial markets to see. Consolidation is only exceptionally about states ceasing to borrow altogether. Even after a state's accumulated debt has begun to shrink, there will for a long time be old debt left that has to be refinanced on a revolving basis. States, therefore, regardless of whether their debt is growing or declining, continue to have a vital interest in low risk premiums on government bonds. That's sort of the shared interest of governments in European Monetary Union. Even if the Greek state looks like it's defaulting, then markets may think that that could spread to the rest and then it becomes. Therefore, the Germans, the French, and everybody else try to keep the Greeks alive in order to avoid these ripple effects. And also, the states continue to have interest in low risk premiums, since even a minor increase in the average rate of interest they have to pay may wreak havoc on their finances. Just a little example. If the average interest they pay on their debt increases by just 2 percentage points, and assuming the debt level is roughly the same as GDP, that is 100% GDP, then the yearly payments they have to add would be 2% of GDP. Now, if you look at the German budget, the German federal government's budget, which is about 20% of GDP, and if that would be quite a lot of money. The German defense budget is 1.3% of GDP. So these 2 percentage points would almost sort of would be a lot more than the whole army costs, yeah. And it's a lot of money. Today's emerging consolidation state is a political institutional response to financial markets for a break, to financial markets' demands for a break in the trend toward ever higher public indebtedness at a time when debt levels had been rising dramatically after 2008, annihilating all gains from the first wave of consolidation that began in the 1990s. To continue lending, financial markets want to be assured that public debt is under political control, certified by a demonstrated capacity of governments to halt and indeed reverse its long-term growth. Creditors' calls for consolidation reflect the experience of the last 4 decades that the Keynesian promise of governments deleveraging in good times to be able to incur new debt in bad times was not kept. That fiscal reflation had a ratchet effect, producing ever higher debt levels. That's basically the debate now in European Monetary Union. The Germans sort of think that we have to project the impression that the ratchet effect is no longer in existence, whereas everybody else doesn't know what they do. Doesn't know what they can do other than promise that they will, in 3 or 4 years, actually begin to consolidate. The debt containment or reduction may be achieved by not replacing paid-back debt or failing that by fiscal repression, a combination of low interest rates with higher rates of inflation. I don't want to go through all these details, but basically what I want to say is that if we look at the historical effects at consolidation, it basically happens through the cutting of expenditure rather than the raising of tax revenue. A budget surplus is preferably used to pay off debt or cut taxes to suppress political temptations to restore previous spending cuts. What you do not see in successful consolidation regimes is that they go back to the previous spending pattern after they have evened out the thing. There's a fundamental change in the regime, which, for example, in Sweden right now, you can observe sort of the artificial creation of new budget deficits in a world in which they run continuous budget surpluses by simply sort of lowering taxes so that the specter of the deficit comes back, as a result of which they have to cut spending in order to keep the deficit down or return to a surplus. An established consolidation state is one that has managed to institutionalize a political commitment and build a political capacity never to default on its debt, projecting an uncompromising determination to place its obligations to its creditors above all other obligations. It features a general configuration of political forces that makes spending increases difficult while making spending cuts on everything except debt service easy. Countries with a small state, like the US and Japan, a small state compared to their economy, are more likely to be recognized as consolidation states, since a small government share in the economy can be taken to indicate both an entrenched aversion to state spending and the possibility for tax increases as ultima ratio in financial emergencies. So that explains why Japan and the United States pay so low in interest rates on the things. A country that comes close to the ideal is the United States, which combines powerful anti-taxation politics with a sacrosanct constitutional commitment never to compromise its full faith and credit. It's an interesting story about this. The American Constitution has this, the full faith and credit of the United States shall never be compromised. What it really meant originally was that the politics of the federal government should not be subverted by the states. And then it has sort of taken on the new meaning, that the debt is sacrosanct, that they can never can never apply a haircut to their creditors. In fact, in the United States, as in no other country, it is understood across the political board that properly servicing the public debt must take precedence over everything else, including public pensions. Even the Tea Party movement contributed unintentionally to the perception of the United States as a solid debtor when it was defeated in 2011 and 2013 over the national debt ceiling by a coalition between the president and the Republican leadership, who at the time could not agree on anything except that the United States must in all circumstances service its debt, if necessary by incurring more debt. And then they forced the Tea Party to agree. I have elsewhere described the debt state as having two constituencies, citizens and creditors, or two peoples. In German you can say a Staatsvolk, that's the normal people, and a Marktvolk, the market people. Debt states have to be loyal to both, with the two struggling over who is to be the principal stakeholder and who in a fiscal crunch has to give. The consolidation state settles that struggle in favor of its second constituency, its Marktvolk, by firmly internalizing the primacy of the state's commercial contractual commitments to its lenders over its political public commitments to its citizenry. In a consolidation state, citizens lose out to investors. Rights of citizenship are trumped by claims from commercial contracts. Voters range below creditors. The results of elections are less important than those of bond auctions. Public opinion matters less than interest rates, and citizen loyalties less than investor confidence. Debt service crowds out public services, ideal typically represented in this table. One could also speak, it's also in the book, you don't have to write it down if you buy the book. So. One could also speak of two kinds of public debt, explicit in relation to the markets and implicit in relation to citizens, the latter downgraded in comparison to the former, or of two classes of property rights or entitlement, capitalist and civic, the former rising above the latter. In short, a consolidation state may be described as one whose commercial market obligations take precedence over its political citizenship obligations, where citizens lack access to political or ideological resources with which to contest this. That's the United States in Lucy. Converting a popular democracy into a consolidation state takes time, as it requires disempowering democratic egalitarian politics in favor of solid customership in financial markets. The goal is to resolve the basic ambivalence of democracy as a depersonalized and therefore less capricious, longer-lived and more reliable debtor compared to the kings of the past, on the one hand, and a sovereign agent of wealth allocation and redistribution on the other. This involves tying the hands of the state by redefining its sovereignty into a guarantee of its ability to repay its debt, for example, by making balanced budgets an enforceable constitutional requirement. While a balanced budget or a budget surplus may be presented by governments to citizens as a step on the way to government independence from financial investors, the Swedish Rhetoric, their immediate purpose is to reassure lenders that their investment is safe and that they can at any time be paid and repaid. Lower risk premiums may also be achieved by other institutional reforms to the extent that these credibly prevent future governments from returning to mitigating capitalist distribution conflicts by public spending and thereby jeopardize the state's reliability as a debtor. Preventing the debt state from predating on its lenders may also be done by international means. The verb of predator is to predate.
Yeah.
Rarely
used.
Yeah.
Or to prey on, probably.
To prey on. Yeah.
But with an E.
Much better. States have a collective interest to ensure that the reputation of sovereign debtors is not jeopardized. International institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the European Union help potentially insolvent states with loans, on condition they reform themselves so that they can credibly promise not again to overdraw their accounts. That's the European Central Bank. Discipline may also be exercised by hegemonic countries aligned with global financial markets, such as the United States. The latest case is Argentina. Having borrowed in New York, the country unexpectedly found itself under the jurisdiction of an American court, which declared the restructuring in 2002 of parts of its debt to be illegal, the case of the so-called vulture funds. Now these guys in these vulture funds have tried to use the civil laws of several countries to impound assets of the Argentine state. Up to now, that didn't work, but it seems that if this court ruling stands, this would be the first case. As all major banks have by necessity subsidiaries in the United States, any government using the banking system faces the possibility of American legal action. Turning the debt state of the late 20th century into a consolidation state is not an easy undertaking, especially as it takes place in hard economic times. With economic inequality growing everywhere, debt-financed social expenditure helped states maintain an appearance of egalitarian even-handedness. Budget balancing by cutting social benefits and social services risks a democratic backlash unless political institutions are rebuilt to insulate economic policies from popular electoral pressures, as in a Hayekian or post-democratic world, or in the European monetary union, where the central bank doesn't even have a government to talk to. It has 18 governments that they can play off against each other. Moving towards a consolidation state is also made difficult by the fact that it's taking place at a time of low growth, if not secular stagnation, with austerity likely to cause further economic contraction. It is also made more urgent by the additional debt accumulated as a result of the financial crisis, as I said. To investors in public finance seeking reassurance that their investment is safe, economic growth is as important as balanced budgets. Both at the same time are, however, difficult, if not impossible, to obtain. Politically, institutional reforms and fiscal austerity are hard to impose under low growth and rising inequality on a society that still has recourse to democratic elections. while economically they may further impair aggregate demand and produce a deflationary downward spiral. The remedy of the former is to withdraw authority over economic policy from the electorate, Europe, and the latter is the central banks. I'll say something on that in a minute, and then I'll end this. Although the reigning neoliberal doctrine promises growth as a future reward for present austerity, for investors waiting to be paid, that promise may be too uncertain and the future too far away to make them feel better. The transformation of the debt set is underway, but is far from smooth. While interrelated through global financial markets, its local manifestations differ, although the logic is the same everywhere. Some institutional reforms have been implemented, but many are still work in progress. In Europe especially, consolidation is politically contested, in particular in countries like France and Italy. As creditors worry about consolidation subverting economic growth, and governments about austerity undercutting political stability, public debt has further increased in most countries and was still rising in 2014, even though nobody believes present levels to be sustainable. Currently, much of the refinancing of debt states is provided by central banks. In the United States and Japan directly, in Europe indirectly, by the European Central Bank lending to national banking systems, which in turn lend to their national states. Now that's sort of, in my view, the fourth stage, so to speak. Inflation, the first wave of public debt, then the rise of private debt, now central bank debt. Here we are. This is the total assets of the central banks in the world. And you see, and this starts only in 2006, and in those few years, it's essentially more than doubled. Federal Reserve, the Euro system will really start next month to add to this. The balance sheets of the leading central banks have rapidly expanded since 2008. Historically low interest rates and unprecedented infusions of liquidity into the world economy have as yet failed to stimulate economic growth, thereby making market-conforming reforms more palatable. If there had been growth, they would have been more palatable and helping states pay their lenders. Like public debt, there is agreement among economic elites that the policy of cheap money cannot forever be continued. What is being debated is how long it can still be relied upon and how it can be ended without causing a new political economic mega crisis. That's what they are really concerned about. Now, if I had more time, I would now say something on the specificities of the European Monetary Union, but I already mentioned a few things about this. Then, what I've started in the book, where you can read it, but also, which I'm not going to read to you now because we need some time for discussion. What I'm trying to do now is to sort of thresh out the basic outlines of the consolidation, what I call the consolidation regime, using the concept of regime that Paul Pearson applied to the American fiscal policy since or politics since the 1990s. And there are quite a few sort of things that one can now see. The most important thing is budget balancing always by cutting expenditure, never by raising taxes. The other is never return to the old system, change the budgeting institutions as well as the politics of a society so that it is biased in the direction of a smaller state. That opens up all sorts of opportunities for liberalization, for privatization. Sweden, again, is one of the most fascinating examples. We still think Sweden is sort of a socialist paradise. But by now, in the secondary school system, 50% of students attend private schools. Private schools that are funded by the state, run on a for-profit basis by several large corporations that have now developed enormously effective ways of lobbying the government so that regulations are being withdrawn so that they can be more selective when they take in students and all. So this whole game begins as you begin to consolidate. You almost inevitably open up the public sector for private investment and private business. You also have an effect that I describe in the book, but here more in more detail, which is that mandatory expenditures, for example, expenditures on pensions. As you begin to cut down the state, their share in the public budget begins to increase at the expense of investment, what we call infrastructure and soft social investment. That enormously increases the pressure and builds coalitions against the old social security systems. In Sweden now, the pension system is on a completely actuarial basis. It's totally cut off from the public budget. And if the revenue of the pension system declines, pensions are automatically cut. Yeah? In order to make sure that this shrinking public sector can still has still some space for investment. Now, the Swedes, of course, start at a very high level, and they are sort of on a landing path that will take a long time. But that very same phenomenon is observed in other countries that begin with a smaller state and begin to consolidate. Finally, maybe I want to say something. We have looked at I think 6 or 7 countries in great detail how their budgets were and how their spending patterns changed since the mid-1990s when this first wave of consolidation began. Britain is a very interesting exception in this. Britain, under New Labour, increased spending on against poverty, on labour market policy, but it was the only country where these things increased, but at the same time the budget deficit increased. That it is not proof that you can do it during consolidation. You do it at the expense. In this world that we're talking about, where the revenue capacity of the government is sort of slowly declining, in this world you can do this only at the expense of accumulating a legacy that you will at some stage will hit home at you. And I interpret what the Conservative government in Britain does as exactly this thing. So thank you for listening, and there's more to be said, but it's all in the book.
It's a great pleasure to be asked to comment on Wolfgang's book. He and I have known each other since 1977, before most of you were born. Next week there's a great fest in Cologne to mark his retirement from his present post. And at that event, I shall have to say a lot of nice words about him, which means I don't have to do it now, because it will go to his head. So I'll just get straight into the business. I want to concentrate on the contribution to political understanding of this book. Because it's called, at least it's in the German version. I've only seen the British version outside, the English version outside there. I only know the German version. The subtitle was The Postponed Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. I assume that has survived, isn't it? So it is actually about politics. And in a way, well, not in a way, Wolfgang is definitely suggesting that democracy and capitalism may not be that compatible in the future. I wrote a review of the German version in a journal last year in which I said that the task he's undertaken is a bit like that of those people who wanted to demonstrate in the late 16th century that the earth went round the sun and not the other way round. people's everyday observation seemed against it. Look, the sun starts there and it goes there. Of course it goes around the earth. Well, we've got elections, haven't we? Of course we've got democracy. And very, very powerful people were telling them, of course, the earth is the centre of the world. Of course, you live in perfect democracies. But the heliocentric theorists and Wolfgang had superior and elegant theoretical arguments on their side. I hope the analogy ends there, and that unlike Galileo Galilei, he will not be shown the instruments of torture and asked to recant. But at least there is that much. Liberal democracy still has that much liberalism in it. What I see as very fundamental to this is that argument that he did, well, it's gone from the board now, that difference between the idea that states, democratic states, have these two constituencies they have to satisfy: the Staatsvolk, the citizenry, and the Marktvolk, the market people. And he spells out there the different sets of responsibilities they have towards these two groups. And it is very clear from that you cannot say that governments only have responsibility to their electors. They have also these responsibilities to Marktvolk. And it's quite clear as you go through his list which set of responsibilities are likely to be heavier as states get more and more into debt. And so it is the theory of the Schuldenstaat, the debtor state. There's always a danger when one has a theory that one seeks to extrapolate it and to assume a convergence of everyone on the same point. And I suspect there is still room for debate about whether the Nordic countries will all have to end up like the United States, or whether there aren't different social settlements and social compromises in different regimes. But Wolfgang himself did say that the path to the Consolidation State was hard and difficult. And it may well be that different groups can get victories of different kinds as one goes along that trajectory. But at the present time, the most successful consolidation states would be certain states in Central and Eastern Europe who have very, very low levels of debt. Now, in a way, these states are the vanguard of the New World. They have already achieved very, very small states. They haven't had to go through the struggle of getting rid of liberal democratic welfare states. They started, as they emerged from the Soviet Union, they started with formal democracy that was already a kind of post-democracy, in that there weren't really parties, because the Soviet system had really destroyed all sense of what parties were about and what identities were. And so they've never really had party systems grounded in strong identities. And so it's been much easier in those countries to move quickly to the consolidation state. It will be much harder to do that in countries with long and entrenched democratic regimes. So I think what Wolfgang gives us is a terrain of struggle. He indicates convincingly the direction of that struggle, but we don't know at what point actions have reactions that lead to different solutions. Another part of the argument, which is it's not. I said I'd concentrate on the political issues. This is really more of an economic one, and that is the changing relationship between debtors and creditors, where at least where states are concerned and where relatively poor people are concerned. That takes place. And Wolfgang, at one point in the book, compares the treatment of bankruptcy of corporations in US law with the treatment of countries in great deficit. And the United States is always praised for having very enlightened bankruptcy laws, so that if you go bankrupt, I've gone bankrupt, right? You declare it under some section of some act, and it's a bit painful for a while, but in the end you come out still functioning, and your creditors have taken quite a hit. And this is compared favourably with the traditional German approach to bankruptcy, whereas where you go bankrupt, you really ought to go out and shoot yourself, and it's quite shameful if you don't do that. And this is considered, and I think in the past accurately, to reflect a more enlightened attitude towards risk on the part of American law. the same leniency is not taken towards states in debt. There, something else has been going on, and that is a change in the balance of relationships between creditors and debtors from what one might see as the original one, or certainly one that actually is still maintained really in US bankruptcy law, and that is that a creditor and a debtor are together in the transaction. If you lend money to a firm, then you share the responsibility for what that firm does with it, because you have said, yeah, you're worthy my lending you money. Right? So therefore, if it goes wrong, you are also to blame. You're part of the act. And that is deep in the original concept of the relationship between creditor and debtor. Certainly, if you have that kind of relationship, you will get slower growth. Lenders will take far fewer risks than in the present world, but you will be spared deep crises. And there's a couple of recent books by two Italians, Massimo Amato and Luca Fantacci, on the decline of the creditor relationship, in that what happened through the extension of modern credit markets, those markets, those financial secondary and derivatives markets that eventually destroyed us all in 2008. What happened there was that creditors never needed to bother to know what was going on in the firms or individuals or countries to whom they lent money, because the idea of lending it was not actually to be part of a long-term relationship around certain projects, but to sell the debt to someone else, and they would buy it not because they knew anything about it, but because they were going to sell it on to someone else. So that infinite regression of debt trading meant that creditors no longer had any interest in what they were actually lending to, which means that when they got caught out by low-value mortgage holders or by states, they said, well, we're not having this. We didn't go into this expecting to lose money. And they, in the case of states and also low-income people, they've been allowed to do that. And debtors have had to bear increasingly the burden of the failure of the credit-debt relationship. And that intensifies further the forces that Wolfgang's talking about, because the creditor, who has to be, to start with, the holder of enormously large numbers of funds, the creditor is an extremely powerful person. They've become a constituency, at least alongside the citizenship of states, and they have changed the relationship they have towards debtors. So I've got a few reservations about Wolfgang's arguments. I've said some of them about that. I think that there's probably more diversity among countries than he recognises, although in a way he does it by saying that it's quite a hard road to the consolidation state. He allows space actually for diversity in that. Also, I've got quarrels with him about what happened to the southern European countries, but since he didn't talk about that, I won't either. Instead, I just draw attention to the many important insights that there are in this book. And, apart from the main theme, there are many sort of side issues that give you fascinating new insights onto things. For example, at one point he discusses what was a big theme in the late 1970s, and that was what was called the ungovernability. There was a big anxiety, mainly on the political right and on the academic right, that modern societies were becoming ungovernable, because people weren't deferential anymore, and they didn't realise they couldn't keep having more and more, and they wouldn't accept constraints. There was then a left-wing version of this, mainly articulated by Wolfgang's old opponent, Jürgen Habermas, which called the legitimation crisis, that capitalism had got a crisis of legitimacy, that people didn't believe in it anymore. And Wolfgang demonstrates very clearly that this can be stood entirely on its head. It was the other way round. The ordinary working people never actually rebelled against capitalism. In fact, as the rise in female labour force participation took place, people were rushing to go and work in the capitalist economy, increasingly accepting the legitimacy of being engaged in market relations. It was capitalists who ratted on the post-war democratic capitalist compromise by saying they weren't going to be part of it anymore and rejecting many parts of that deal, leading eventually, of course, to the debtor-state model. So it's a very interesting argument that the legitimacy of the post-war compromise was rejected by capital, not by ordinary citizens. And I think we can draw a lot of conclusions from that. So the book is full of very important facts and empirical arguments, but the most important thing really is that this is all theoretically grounded in showing it's not just saying that, there's lots of powerful groups around who undermine democracy. In the model of the role of debt, the role of creditors, he gives us a strong basis on which to articulate arguments of that kind. And in the end, I think that is the most important contribution of the work.
Good. Well, very good. Well, we've got plenty of time for some questions. So who would like to... To the lady, and then the gentleman behind. Yep. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much. My name is Ulla Lambrecht. I'm German, but I live here. The Staatsvolk and the Marktvolk is fascinating, the two words. The question would be what we live in right now is becoming Marktvolk as far as the privatization of the National Health Service is concerned. So is there a way where we can remain a bit of Staatsvolk and not become total Marktvolk in the health service?
That's exciting. That's an interesting question. I don't know. What's the rule?
We make up the rule.
I use these terms very sort of specifically in order to not overly expand it. So in my schema of things, the Marktvolk is the capital market folk. That is the claimants to public resources in terms of interest payment and all of these things. Now, but one can, of course, what you're looking at is equally interesting, which is that as the public sector and the state are being shrunk, more and more transactions that in the past have been conducted in the medium of citizenship rights are now being converted into the medium of market transactions, where you have to, first of all, pay for them, but then you need providers that are sort of profit-oriented and are willing to consider you a customer rather than a citizen entitled to a particular service on the basis of your citizenship. That transformation, to me, this is a classical case of the expansion of capitalist market relations into areas of life that for good reasons have been protected from being marketized under what we call the post-war regime of democratic capitalism. These services have become institutionalized as entitlements that are generated out of politics rather than as goods that you can buy in a market. As you shrink the state, as you move from the debt state, my story of this is this magnificent regime of public provision for elementary and even less, even not merely elementary needs, on the basis of citizenship entitlement. This magnificent regime has been able or has been maintained for a while by borrowing, because it no longer had the resources that were required for this. Now the hour of truth has come. Public finances are being consolidated. The historical attempt is made to reverse a development that this really genius of political economy, Rudolf Goldscheid, unfortunately unknown outside Germany and even in Germany, not very much known. And around the First World War, he was sort of an enemy of Max Weber. They were always fighting each other. Weber hated him because he was a millionaire and didn't have to have a university career, and nevertheless he sort of produced excellent stuff. And in any case, Goldscheid had this idea, which he had taken from a very conservative German economist, man named Wagner, Wagner's law in Anglo-American countries. Who had this idea that as a civilization becomes more and more sophisticated, modern, cultivated, as Wagner called it, in Goldscheid's language, who was a Marxist, as the relations of production become more and more socialized, the share of the government in the national economy has to increase, so that a point will be reached where capitalist relations of production sort of are being overturned or challenged by this dialectical force, which is that they can be maintained only with a growing input of public services, both in terms of repairing the damages that capitalist expansion does, and in terms of financing the collective preconditions for the private making of profit. So that's Marx, that's Goldscheid, in a famous debate in the German Sociological Association, which led Max Weber to resign from it, although he had been one of the founders. In a famous debate, Schumpeter and Goldscheid sort of agreed, Schumpeter, that was a sound analysis, and that therefore, as Schumpeter said, at some stage, capitalism will have to disappear because it can't work anymore, because it clashes against the collective. And what we see now is an attempt. So you can look at the rising share of the state and at the increase in state indebtedness as sort of totally in line with these early predictions. And now, 1990s for the first time, now even more, a fundamental attempt is being made to redefine the state so that this is not going to happen. That is to privatize infrastructure, to privatize investment, and so on and so on and so on. That's the idea. And therefore, the thing that I've presented now is much bigger than it looks. It may look like he's talking about public budgets. No, he's talking about the rebuilding of the state at a time where the capacity of the state to extract the resources from the capitalist political economy that are required to sustain that economy, where that capacity has ended. And where it was sort of feasible to do this only through growing indebtedness of the state. That's the story. And in that part of the story, your story fits, of course, very nicely. Sorry, that was a bit long.
That's great. That's great.
Bernard Casey from the University of Warwick and this place. I want to follow on with this question of redefining and rebuilding, because I'm interested in efforts, whether or not I agree with them, of those who seek to defend or redefine the role of the state. And I'm interested in the way in which marked folk speak has been taken on by certain advocates of a role of the state. And in particular, I'm interested in this concept of social investment. I don't know whether Anton Hemmerich is here or not, but it's something which I
was going to be.
No, Anton is not.
He's not here. Okay, I can't see who's down in front. No. But it seems to me that this is an attempt to take on a certain language to justify a certain role for the state. Now, those of us who are old enough will remember that, 15, 20 years ago, we used to talk about something called social protection as a productive factor. That kind of disappeared, and it's now being reinvented as this thing called social investment. We also find, and you mentioned the case of Italy, a case of France, people attempting to redefine what is meant by public expenditure under the terms of the Maastricht Treaty rules and so forth, so that they talk about certain kinds of public expenditures being efficient and acceptable, and certain things should not be counted as consumption, which accounting systems require them to be counted as, but should in fact be treated as investment. I wonder whether you could comment upon this development, because it certainly has a sort of strength and it is certainly being employed in certain places.
Yeah, very little to add to what you're saying, except that when we look empirically at what we can identify as social investment in the budgets of several of these states, then we see that public investment, public social investment, is declining. For example, the spending of the Swedish state on what used to be called active labor market policy in the last 10 years was almost halved. At the same time, the average sort of Swedish unemployment rate went up to between 7 and 8%. And those of us who have been around for a little longer remember that in Sweden, well into the 1980s, the idea that you could have more than, let's say, 1.5% unemployment would have been like, I don't know, like what? I don't even want to invent a gross example for this. It was so gross that nobody would ever have said that. And now it's the new normal, 8%. Yeah. So this decline in effort, yeah, sort of translates into a political, neoliberal political practice, which would say that no, investment in qualifications is not something that we should do because individuals carry their qualifications themselves, and so they should do it. Let them take credit, let them take up money, and then they pay for it, and then they earn it back. The only problem is that if you like in the United States now, you have sort of study after study. People graduate from universities, they have $40,000 in debt, and so they can't take up new debt to buy a car, which in the American way of things is absolutely necessary to maintain the American economy. You have to buy a car and a house, and for this you have to lend money, but to borrow money. But if you have already borrowed too much, you can't do that. So there is, you could call this in a sort of way a contradiction, which if you make an effort through 4 or 5 or 6 steps, you can derive from Karl Marx himself. You have to make a deductive effort for this.
Yeah, in the absence of Anton Hemmerich, who was my doctoral student many years ago, I would come to the defence of the social investment welfare state. I don't think it is a cop-out of any kind. It is saying that large parts of public spending can actually serve to increase the size of the economy. So, and there's good evidence to show that's the case. And it undermines what is otherwise the way in which one sort of automatically tends to speak, which is to regard public spending as money that is placed in a hole in the ground and removed from circulation. And this is clearly untrue. And various kinds of public spending can contribute to the capitalist economy. For example, to take a very hard case, and something that's usually seen as not part of the social investment welfare state, where unemployment pay is very generous, workers are more likely to be willing to take risks and less likely to insist on strong employment protection laws. And that can then be functional to the functioning of markets and in a kind of positive sum way. So I don't think that it is just a question of people talking using mark folk language. I think it's a genuine contribution.
Yeah. Just in your last slide there, we've seen Japan in this cycle for many, many years. And I kind of just wonder now, is the kind of the fifth stage when the central banks actually start to have to write off their debts?
Can you say that again?
With the central bank, maybe the fifth stage is actually the central bank starting to have defaults on some of their assets they hold.
Yeah, it's very interesting and intriguing to see. 2 years ago, when I wrote the book, I wasn't aware of this enormous controversy which is going on inside the central bank world. The central bank of central banks, the mother of all central banks, which is the Bank for International Settlements in Basel's, I think you say Basel, yeah. Lot of Basel, the Bank of International. They get very nervous about this. They produce these charts, yeah, but the national central banks. Like the Fed, a year ago, began in Bernanke's last year, he began to think about when to get off the tiger, when to end quantitative easing. The first time he sort of announced that he would end quantitative easing, you remember the stock exchanges plunged, yeah? And so now they tread more carefully. In the meantime, they discovered that quantitative easing, especially the Japanese, might lead to devaluation of their currency, which they think is a good idea, because then you can start a competitive devaluation race. Maybe that is the fifth stage, and that is again deadly. Yeah? We remember that from the 1930s. Everybody now Draghi is telling us that his wonderful new program, by which he basically serves as a bad bank for the European banking system, that this wonderful new program will maybe lower the value of the euro and thereby help the southern European countries. The reality is that it helps countries that have a strong export base like Germany. Therefore, the Germans do not complain. If the euro goes down...
Complain. Schäuble complain.
Thanks. Robert Wade in the Department of International Development here at LSE. Colin Crouch made the point that we have bankruptcy regimes for individuals and for companies, but we don't have a bankruptcy regime for states. We don't have a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, for example, although at a certain point the IMF even, and Kruger at the IMF, tried to push this. Do you, Wolfgang, think that this is something that is the creation of bankruptcy regime for states is something that citizens' movements should be focusing on promoting, and what chances do you think there are that such a regime might be established?
Yeah, it is difficult to convince citizens that they should demonstrate in the streets for a bankruptcy regime for governments. That would require a long story at the beginning. But even more on the serious side, the problem is sovereignty. Yeah, the problem is sovereignty. You can have sort of mediation procedures or something like this, but ultimately, whether a state actually delivers at the end. You can't even do it inside the European Union in the last 2 years, or the European Monetary Union. So there were attempts to do this. Nobody could agree how to do it, and what should be the substance of it. And then the investors have interest in this, the states have interest in this, the strong states have other interests than the weak states. Very difficult.
Alex Murray from UCL. I'd like to introduce a concept we've not discussed yet. It takes us a little bit away from political economy straight into core economics, that of productivity. It's the golden goose that will solve all of these problems in theory. I'm interested to hear your views on if there's a link between what you're talking about here and the determination of modern productivity. It's been, at least in the UK, it's pretty much flatlined over the last 10 years. And I wonder what Hayek might think of our monetary policies at present. I recall the headlines a couple of years ago talking about the zombie economy, the fact that there are millions of people working in firms that might otherwise not exist in a tighter, more realistic monetary environment.
Yeah, I'm not an economist, but I notice that economists are very much in disagreement on what is productivity, where does it come from? Gordon, I became interested in these articles by this American economist named Robert Gordon, who claims that historically most of the possibilities of increasing productivity in a sort of socially compatible way have already been exhausted. And that the potential of technological change to increase productivity in such a way that it does not result in even more inequality and unemployment has been sort of used. I'm not. I know that economists debate this. I'm not. But what I, as a sociologist, can maybe say is that within the European Monetary Union, we now have this ongoing debate about the Mediterranean countries. Colin sort of referred to this, which are being told by the Germans and basically also by the central bank that they can increase productivity in two ways: cutting wages, then the unit costs decline, or produce better units that justify the wages. That is, build an Audi plant in what have you, southern Italy. Right? Now we know that both of this is extremely difficult, and that in my view, and Colin and I sort of worked on these things in the 1980s and were excited about what we saw. How different capitalist economies developed in different directions in terms of their social systems of production. In my view, in this sort of period, 1980s, different paths were chosen as to how you combine technology with skills, with training systems, and so on. And it is extremely difficult to copy or to move from one path to the other. In fact, and I think here I hope I'm in agreement with political economists like David. In different countries, different sort of social compacts were made to accommodate the political and social forces so that they could live with the specific production arrangements that these countries had produced. So in a way, the French always depended on a very strong public sector, which very strongly depended on the capacity of the French state to run a deficit in its spending. Whereas the Italians depended on a relatively high rate of inflation in order to maintain some degree of employment, as well as devalue their government debt. So these were sort of political settlements that are all sort of invalidated by this sort of rigid prescription that now you have to become honest. Honest means German style, first save, then spend. And these are very different economies that function in very different ways. And therefore you have these that is also an aspect of sort of productivity and the politics of productivity.
So we've got, I'm afraid, just time for two more questions. I just see what the time is. So
thank you.
Very quick.
Yes. In your theory, you mentioned how the financial capital has found other ways of avoiding taxation and that it's a power group now that has consolidated. It seems to me that with inflation being as stubborn as it has been and may continue to be so, that perhaps there's a chance of our entering into an era of debt forgiveness, perhaps. And I don't mean in the form of inflation, because that's not there. Where these power brokers might actually sit back and say, let's just kind of rearrange the puzzle pieces because there's too much stress and so forth.
Very, very, very quick answer. Well, maybe we take these two questions. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. Rune Stahl from Copenhagen University. I would just ask. Now we have David Soskice in the panel. To what extent do you find that this analysis that you've shown today, does it agree or does it clash with the idea of varieties of capitalism?
Yes.
I hope I don't start a fight here.
We start a new seminar.
We start a new. Come back next week for the.
We'll do. Let's get an hour together sometime, and we can just talk this through. Now, sorry, I have got a polite reminder. Please notify members of the audience that there will be a book sale and book signing taking place inside the theatre. I think it's just slightly outside the theatre, but it's just here. So can I thank Wolfgang and Colin very, very much indeed for a marvellous performance. And yes.